Hi, I'm Don Dent, and we're here today talking about mission strategy in Paul. And this topic raises a really important question that we really need to talk about right here at the beginning before we start talking about all kinds of other things related to Paul. Because really the question does come up, and a lot of people ask, why focus on Paul's mission methodology so long ago? Or, Paul was an apostle, it's different from anything we know today, or the world's changed some. There's so many reasons that people would seriously question, well, why even spend time talking about mission strategy in Paul? All of that happened so long ago. Well, not everyone believes that we should talk about Paul, and I'd like to tell you why I think that we should, but we have to acknowledge there's a lot of people, there's a lot of missiologists and a whole bunch of missionaries who really don't think that much about Paul. And so some influential missiologists admire Paul, but then they don't think that we can emulate him today. So, okay, let's, just out of biblical interest and historical concern, we could study about Paul, and Kenneth Scott Latourette, one of the greatest mission historians ever. I love reading his stuff. He could describe what Paul did, but he honestly thought that the modern world he lived in the early 1900s was so different that there was no way we could emulate him. David Bosch wrote a beautiful book almost a generation ago now on missions and the different paradigms of missions. And he has a great section where he talks about Paul, but then at the end of it, he essentially summarizes, well, Paul was Paul, we're not him, so we can't really try to follow his methodology too closely. And if we look around the world today, the missions world, we'll see a lot of mission agencies and famous advocates, actually, who, if you follow along, you just don't see any evidence that they are consciously looking to Paul as a model of what they're advocating for or what they are actually doing somewhere around the world today. Some people refer to Paul as a model. You'll hear say, oh, well, yeah, we're trying to be Pauline, or, I read the Bible and I want to be like Paul. But quite often what we see, and I know that at times I've probably been guilty of this, we're only doing it in a piecemeal manner. We pick one little piece of Paul's model, his example and his pattern of ministry, and then we ignore whole other sections of it. Now, Roland Allen, that we're going to talk about in another video, really turned me on to being really interested in mission strategy and seeing Paul as the ultimate model for that. And in his book written in 1912, he said, Paul gets blamed for a lot of really bad strategy because people are only thinking about one little piece of his model, but not the whole thing. And there are many other options. There are a lot of people who say, well, no, don't follow Paul. Let's just be like Jesus. And there's a lot to draw us to that. I mean, as a follower of Jesus, I want to be like him in my life, in my character, all those kinds of things. And today we hear a lot of people talk about, well, we're just supposed to go and live and do the kingdom of God. Maybe because they haven't gotten another idea. There are a lot of people, a lot of missionaries and mission teams. Maybe they're sent out by a church and they essentially go overseas and follow the standard operating procedure of the church that they came from, thinking, we're extending our church's ministry, and so we're just going to make it look as much like church back wherever that is. It could be in Kenya or Kentucky, wherever. And then we also see a lot of mission work that's done that really has a very specialized focus. It doesn't have the core mission activities that we see in Paul, or maybe it has one of them. It might be about evangelism, but not discipleship. It might be about discipleship, but not evangelism. It might be about either one of those and not about church planting, which Paul was the quintessential church planter. So there are all kinds of other options out there in the world that we could say, and all of these things are good, and we should learn from these things. I still am going to advocate that Paul is unique as a mission model and to teach us mission strategy. So why focus on Paul's paradigm? Well, first, Paul was extraordinarily successful. In fact, we have to just say he's one of the most successful missionaries in history. As Roland Allen wrote, in little more than 10 years, St. Paul established the church in 4 provinces of the Roman Empire: Galatia, Macedonia, Achaia, and Asia. And we see that he's involved in ministry in other places as well. Before AD 47, there were no churches in these provinces. In AD 57, St. Paul could speak as if his work there was done and could plan extensive tours into the far west without anxiety lest the churches which he had founded might perish in his absence for want of his guidance and support. That is an incredible statement, and it's true. This is all true. In 10 years to over such a broad area, Paul considered that his missionary role of establishing the churches in these places is done. Why focus on Paul's paradigm? 2, the New Testament highlights Paul's ministry as a fulfillment of the Great Commission. I mean, that's what the book of Acts, which is called the Acts of the Apostles, and 2/3 of that book really focuses on Paul, not so much on the 12 or any other apostles. So is this meant as just a historical narrative? Or do we have a canonical model of mission from which to learn? I believe it's the second. I love history. I'm reading history right now. I just love history. But I think that by giving us this model in great detail, because if you pull together Acts and the epistles, what we're going to find as we study Paul is there's an amazing amount of detail if we put it together to see how he went about his work. And I think we actually have an inspired model here that is the best model for missions in any generation. Again, Roland Allen. It was certainly meant to be something more than the romantic history of an exceptional man doing exceptional things under exceptional circumstances. You sort of hear that word a lot. Well, Paul was exceptional, so therefore, we can't try to emulate him or follow the kind of pattern of ministry. A story from which ordinary people of a later age can get no more instruction for practical missionary work than they receive from the history of the Cid or the exploits of King Arthur. Just a myth, long ago. Don't know, how we could possibly try to recreate that is the thought of many people. And actually there are many people who actually think of Paul's mission in this way, and I think that's a terrible mistake. Why focus on Paul's paradigm? Well, 3, from Acts and Paul's letters, we have the most detailed knowledge of any early missionary strategy. Not just in the first century, but over the next multiple centuries. In fact, there is much more information than most Christians realize. We need to read this New Testament model missiologically. We read Paul for lots of other things, for theology, for devotion, in our walk with Christ, so many other things. And all that's good, but Paul's primarily missionary. And we have a tremendous amount of information about how he went about this missionary task that God called him to. Obviously, there were many other missionaries working at that time in Paul's life, probably including the 12, which is sort of left out of Acts, right? We get hints of it, but we're not following him. The attention all moves over to Paul and his team. But we simply do not have much specific information about any of the other early missionaries like we have about Paul. So I just ask, shouldn't we focus on the best model we have from the most successful period of Christian mission? I think we should. Why focus on Paul's paradigm? Well, I'll argue, Paul faced challenges that were not unlike those many missionaries face today. Now, obviously, the world has changed a lot since the first century. I mean, they're middle of the Roman Empire. There's so many things that are different. We have technology, of course. There's just so many things that have changed. Our world's a lot smaller, for instance, in terms of geography, but in terms of population, it's much bigger. Yet, when you read this story, Paul and his team are facing so many practical issues that missionaries have to deal with today, and at times it just reminds you, wow, some things really haven't changed all that much. One thing is logistics. How am I going to get there? You know, Paul writes his missionary team and says, hey, bring that cloak. The weather's turning and I'm cold. There wasn't central heating, and he might die from exposure if he doesn't get the right kind of clothing. Just basic logistics, what you're taking in your suitcase kinds of things. Finances. Yeah, Paul's team had to have some money to, in some cases, maybe pay for a place to live, certainly to eat much of the time. And how did they do that? Well, we're going to see a rather ingenious way that they figured out how to do this. And then there are all kinds of personal issues. Paul is a real person, and when we study it in the New Testament, we see he is frequently ill, and his illness changes his plan. Not something we would normally think of. And he gets lonely. Well, are those the kinds of real-life personal issues that missionaries face today? Absolutely. The very same kinds of things. And then there are cultural gaps. Now, Paul had some advantages. Everywhere he went, pretty much, he was in the Roman Empire. He didn't need a visa. He spoke Hebrew and Greek, which was pretty much the lingua franca of everywhere he goes, and probably he speaks some Latin because he's a Roman citizen. But yet there's still these places where he gets to where the local people are talking and thinking in another cultural worldview or a different language, and he sort of misses some things there because cultural gaps were real, not just today around the world. We're going to go out and reach unreached people groups. Those are all very different cultures. We have to take the initiative to cross that gap. And Paul and his team had to deal with some of those things as well. And then there are several examples of some team problems. Paul and Barnabas knew what they had to keep doing, and they agreed on that, but they disagreed on who was going to go with them and where exactly they were going to go. So they split up. There are other places where Paul talks about his great sadness over a member of the team leaving earlier than he thought that they should. He viewed them as having a long-term call like he did, and it just really hurt him and disturbed him. In fact, he felt like they had ignored God's direction for them. And so there's a broken relationship of some kind there. So team problems are real in the mission world today. Anytime you put, let's say 3 families together to work on the same team, and missionaries almost by definition are hard-headed and hard-nosed. Otherwise they don't stay long term. They have to learn to work together. It's not always easy. So that's a real issue today and back then. And then he faced opposition within the church. And not just the church or the community where he was planning a church and presenting the gospel in a new city, those kind of, obviously there's pushback there. But he starts getting pushback from Christians in other places about what he's doing. And actually it's his success that really makes them upset. Yes, we see that today in missions. And then there's just outright persecution. And this followed Paul everywhere he went. One reason is because Paul was so bold. He is preaching to everyone who would listen. It didn't take long for people in a city where the gospel's never been spoken before to recognize he's preaching some new teaching that we've never heard. This is a new God we don't know about, whatever. And so word would spread through the city, especially the smaller cities. And so persecution, he's having to teach those churches that persecution is coming. Let me just tell you, throughout mission history, when the gospel enters into a new ethnicity, a new culture, a new language, there's going to be some response and there's going to always be pushback. This was true of my ancestors, my Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Danish ancestors. All experience the same thing. It's what happens. And, it's interesting. Jesus warned us about it. Paul warns us about it. Peter warns us about it. Everybody in the New Testament talks about it. It's just that we Western Christians generally ignore all of that, and it comes as a surprise. But persecution is real when we go to the unreached. And it's more likely persecution on them than us, but it can hit us as well.